From the Four Rivers Cultural Center in Ontario, Oregon, we bring you the third annual Tradition Keepers Festival, highlighting cultural artists in Oregon's Treasure Valley and beyond. In this episode, you'll meet cowboy poet Randi Johnson.
Cowboy poetry is not something that's specifically to be written. It's something that is meant to be told. It's a story that's meant to be told. And the stories I've always told are either stories I've heard from old cowboys or stories about myself and my brothers. And this poem is called A Miracle, and it's definitely taps into that growing up in ranching and the Western lifestyle. So we learned to ride bronchi horses because we refused to walk home, and before we were teens, we went out on big circles alone. We started packing pocket knives as soon as we turned 5, and even before that, we were learning how to drive. We were turned loose with ropes, bows, and BB guns, where the snakes rattle and fast creeks run. We played tag in pastures with ornery mama cows and had no fear of crossing streets or wandering off in town. We followed our dads on trap lines and ran some of our own, and we raced around on bareback horses with no access to an emergency phone. We hauled or broke 4-H steers, we got kicked and drugged for fun, and as soon as we sold the suckers, we went out and bought a gun. We hated horsemanship helmets and didn't even know they made them for bikes, and we were learning to run four-wheelers while our peers were still on trikes. We rode wagons down steep hills solely for the crash, and every single game we played revolved around contact. We climbed trees about to blow over trying to build forts and built sinking rafts out of rotted barnwood boards. We played in old outbuildings that were falling down around our ears, and our battle scars just kept getting bigger through the years. It's a good thing we had our mama's prayers and the good Lord on our side, because it's nothing short of a miracle that we all survived. We told each other, "You're not that hurt," oh so many times, that it really is a miracle that we all survived. I went to the UK for 2 weeks with my brother and 2 friends of mine a couple years ago, and my brother wore his cowboy hat the entire time. And everywhere we went, people looked like they just saw their favorite princess at Disneyland. They're just like, "It's a cowboy." And everyone wanted to know if my brother rode bulls. So like in the UK, apparently their perception of cowboys is that they ride bulls. And so it was kind of an interesting way to see ourselves through their eyes. And I feel like the stereotypes we get is that all cowboys are the same. Cowboys in Texas are the same as cowboys from Oregon, and cowboys from Montana or Canada are the same as cowboys from Florida. There are cowboys in almost every single state. Well, there are cowboys in every state. There's the Paniolos in Hawaii, and there's Crackers down in Florida. There's Buckaroos in the Great Basin in Montana. And even, up into Canada, down into Mexico, and down into South America, the cowboy culture is not one thing. We like to say that the cowboy world's a small world, but there's big differences between each of those. And the experiences that cowboys in Texas have are very different from the cowboys in Nevada. And, I think that's part of the stereotype is that we're all the same. And I think that's kind of a detriment because when you put everyone in one box, you don't give them room for growth. We don't like to be put in boxes. And we love our way of life, we love our lifestyle, and we work hard at preserving it because there's something in cowboy culture that I think it draws back to my friend from grad school who didn't understand how diverse this culture is and not knowing how many different people from different walks of life are in the rural world and in the ranching world. And it's just that in this part of the country, and I think in Western lifestyle from the get-go, as the pioneers came west after the Civil War and as our country was going through all that upheaval that came out of that, people that came west were coming to start a new life. They came from all over the world. They came from Asia. They came up from Mexico. They came, from the East, and they came from Europe during the gold rush and during those pioneering days. My family on my mom's side in particular is very heavy in that pioneering and mining. And all over Nevada in those mining ghost towns, I have had family members at different times. I had a grandfather or great-grandfather that was the sheriff in Goldfield, and I had another that was born in Bodie, California, another born in Tonopah. So as those people came west, they brought their own cultures with them. They brought their own identities, but they also brought this kind of spirit that has been maintained in the Western lifestyle, that people are judged not on what they look like or where they're from, but what they can do and how they contribute to society, how they contribute to the community. And I feel like that has been really well preserved in the Western lifestyle of, we don't care what you look like, we care about your character and who you are on the inside. I was a rodeo queen for 10 years. I started when I was 12. I was finished by the time I was 22. And as a rodeo queen, it's changed in the last couple of years. I might have a little bit to do with that. I'll claim a little bit of that. But you're seeing a lot more diversity in what rodeo queens look like. But from about the late 90s to about 4 years ago, rodeo queens have looked the same. There's been no change in style. There hasn't been any change in hat shapes or hair, anything. They've looked the same for a long time. And they look the same across the entire country. And that does not represent cowboy culture across the whole country, which is what rodeo queens are supposed to do, especially regional queens. You're supposed to represent your rodeo in your community. And for me, being a buckaroo and I wore taps, I braided my hair, I wore my flat hat, and I did this. I was a rodeo queen for a PRCA rodeo, and that's a huge stage as a rodeo queen. And they loved it. The rodeo committee that I was the queen for at Crooked River Roundup in Prineville, they loved it. They told me when I tried out, we want you the way you are, don't change anything. And that was a risk I took in different titles I tried out for, was this is who I am, and I'm not going to change this, because I represent a huge part not only of the ranching industry, but of the state of Oregon. The whole eastern side of this state is really steeped in the buckaroo traditions. And I feel like that with cowboy poetry is the same way, that when I get up there and I speak and I'm talking about these stories from this part of the world, it's an important piece of the puzzle, because without voices from the entire state of Oregon, you're missing out on what the whole ranching and rodeo is in Oregon. And without voices from across the country, you're missing out on what ranching and rodeo is in the entire country. In an interesting way, being a rodeo queen is why I'm a teacher. It is where I discovered that I love educating people. I love working with children, and children, boys and girls both, love rodeo queens. And as a rodeo queen, you're an ambassador not just for the sport, but also for the ranching industry and the agricultural industry as a whole. And that was a huge deal for me. That might be one of the stereotypes about ranching and cowboys that kind of I could undermine a little bit, is because I think you'd be surprised how many more cowboys write music or write poetry than people think, because they're too shy to share it. And so many guys I know are great storytellers, and a lot of it is wrapped up in that storytelling where they've never written it down, but they've got those stories in their head. And I think for me, that's where my poetry comes from, is wanting to put those stories on paper, because my dad has some of the best stories you'll ever hear, but he'll never write them down. And so I try to write them down, and they lose a little bit of the magic when I put them on paper, because I don't tell the story the same way, but it's still, that story's recorded. And I think for me, that is what's so important about writing other people's stories down in particular, is that it's kind of being a historian in a way and recording these stories for a new generation. This might have started out that way. It was just something I started writing poetry, and I feel like a lot of girls do that in, their teen years. But for me, I think showing people that poetry and cowboy poetry is an important aspect of the American canon, and it gets overlooked a lot because it does have that stereotype of kind of being out in the sticks and having this drawl or whatever, and might be kind of chuckled at. But there's real important and valuable stories in the Western and cowboy poetry scene that I feel like Elko does a great job of promoting. And if nothing else, if I can contribute to that a little bit in, putting cowboy poetry on a stage where people can see it and appreciate it and realize that it is an important part of American storytelling. And I just love telling stories. For me, poetry is not something I sit down and I write every morning. That's not how my brain works. That's not how my writing works. But I would love to get a book published here in the near future. I've been saying this for years, but that's probably my major goal. I'm a second grade teacher, and I love that. And for me, it's kind of interesting how I can bring this into my classroom at different times. We'll have like a little miniature vocabulary lesson, and we'll read a poem. And I live in a rural community, but so many of my students are from town and aren't a part of that, that it gives me an opportunity to educate them about the world they live in that they're not quite familiar with yet. And just for me, kind of in continuing that education frame of mind, I'd love to get a book published at some point. But for me, I write poetry for me more than anything else. That people like it and like to hear me speak it is a bonus.